Bishop Ulrich stood upon the stone ramparts of Augsburg and watched an army arrive to kill everyone inside. The heat of August 955 did not bring the usual lethargy of summer to the city. Instead, it brought a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight upon the chest of every man standing on the walls. This was the silence of a world about to end. Ulrich was 60 years old. His hands, more accustomed to the smooth vellum of Scripture and the cold silver of the Eucharist chalice, now gripped the grit-covered crenellations. He was a prince of the church, a man of quiet administration, property disputes, and holy days. But as he looked toward the eastern horizon, the liturgy was far from his mind. He was no longer a shepherd of souls, he was the commander of a fortress. At first, the threat appeared as a trick of the shimmering heat, a smudge of gray against the vibrant green of the Bavarian plains. Then, it grew. It was not a cloud. It did not move with the wind. It was a dark, shifting stain that bled across the earth, wide and unstoppable. It was the sound that reached them next, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Not the thunder of a storm, but the synchronized drumming of tens of thousands of unshod hooves. The Magyars had arrived. They did not come with the disorganized chaos of a common raiding party. They moved with the terrifying precision of a predator that had hunted this ground for 50 years. To the people of Augsburg, these were not merely soldiers. They were the Plaga Dei, the scourge of God. For half a century, the name Magyar had meant the end of all things. It meant the smoke of burning monasteries, the sight of empty cradles, and the disappearance of entire villages into the dust of the eastern steppes. Ulrich looked down at his defenders. There were perhaps a few hundred professional men-at-arms, their mail shirts heavy with the salt of their own sweat. Beside them stood the townsmen, butchers, tanners, and smiths clutching spears they barely knew how to level. They looked to the bishop, searching for a sign of divine intervention or a simple word of hope. But as Ulrich looked back at the horizon, he saw the cold reality. The horsemen were spreading out, encircling the city, cutting off the roads, and choking the life out of the valley. This was not a raid for gold or wine. This was a deliberate, calculated siege. If Augsburg fell, the gates to the heart of the German territories would swing wide. There would be no one left to stop the fire from reaching the Rhine. The southern frontier would collapse, and the dream of a unified Christian empire would be strangled in its infancy. The Magyars did not immediately charge. They did not need to. They sat on their sturdy, deep-chested ponies just out of bowshot, watching. Their silence was more terrifying than a war cry. In the center of their massed ranks, the sunlight glinted off the scales of lamellar armor and the recurve bows that could put an arrow through a man's throat before he heard the string snap. These were the warriors who had humiliated the descendants of Charlemagne. They had turned the great kingdoms of the West into tributaries, forcing kings to pay for the privilege of not being slaughtered. They were the ghosts of the steppe, and today, they had come to claim Augsburg as their own. They were a force of 50,000, a number that contemporary chroniclers might have inflated to emphasize the gravity of the threat, but to the men on the walls, the distinction between 20,000 and 50,000 was academic. It was a sea of horses and steel that reached as far as the eye could see. Ulrich turned away from the horizon and faced his men. His voice, aged but steady, broke the suffocating quiet. "They have come to see if we are a people of stone or a people of dust," he said. "King Otto is marching. He is the hammer, but we must be the anvil. If we break, he has nothing to strike against." The siege had begun. The bells of the cathedral began to toll, not for a mass, but as a countdown. Every strike was a second stolen from a city that was rapidly running out of time. The defenders watched as the first Magyar scouts began to test the perimeter, their arrows arching into the city like black rain. There was no turning back. The survival of the West rested on the shoulders of a priest and a few hundred desperate men. They were outnumbered, isolated, and standing in the shadow of a power that had not known a true defeat in 2 generations. As the first sun of the siege began to set, casting long, bloody hues across the Lechfeld, the bishop knelt on the stone. He did not pray for a miracle. He prayed for time. History often remembers the kings who ride to the rescue, but it is forged by the men who refuse to move when the world tells them they are already dead. This was the first day of the end of an era, and as the fires of the Magyar camp began to dot the plain like fallen stars, the people of Augsburg realized that tomorrow would not be a battle for a city, but a struggle for the soul of a continent. To understand why the sight of that army on the Lechfeld caused such primal terror, we must first unlearn the lies that Western chronicles have told us for 1,000 years. The monks who wrote the histories called them monsters. They called them barbarians, a word that summons images of wild, unthinking brutes stumbling out of the darkness to smash civilization. But the Magyars were not unthinking. And they were certainly not stumbling. They were the apex predators of a way of war that was older than Rome, older than Athens, a way of war honed on the endless, unforgiving ocean of grass that stretches from the borders of China to the Carpathian Mountains. They were not a mob, they were a machine. And by 955 AD, they were the most sophisticated military force in the known world. The terror began with the bow. To a Frankish or Saxon soldier, a bow was a hunting tool, or perhaps a weapon for a peasant too poor to afford a spear. It was made of a single piece of yew or ash, prone to warping in the wet and snapping in the cold. Its range was limited, its power negligible against mail armor. The Magyar bow was different. It was a composite masterpiece of engineering, constructed from layers of wood, animal horn, and sinew, all glued together with fish bladder adhesive. It took months, sometimes years, to craft a single weapon. When unstrung, it curled backward into a C shape, resisting the archer's hand with immense tension. When strung, that tension was stored as lethal kinetic energy. This weapon could drive an armor-piercing bodkin point through a male hauberk at 100 paces. But the weapon itself was only half the equation. The true marvel was the platform from which it was fired. The Magyars lived, fought, and often died on the backs of their horses. These were not the massive, grain-fed destriers of the Western Knights, beasts that required meticulous care and tired quickly. The Magyar steppe pony was smaller, uglier, and infinitely tougher. They could forage under snow for grass, endure days without water, and march distances that would kill a European warhorse. More importantly, they were smooth. A steppe pony at a gallop provided a stable platform for an archer who had been riding since he could walk. A Magyar warrior didn't just sit on his horse, he flowed with it. He used high stirrups that allowed him to stand in the saddle, isolating his upper body from the movement of the beast beneath him. He could shoot forward, to the side, and, most famously, backward. This was the Parthian shot, a tactic so devastating it had become a nightmare for every army that faced them. The Magyars would charge, release a volley of arrows, and then, just as the heavy European cavalry prepared to engage, they would wheel their horses around and flee. To a Western commander, this looked like panic. It looked like victory. The knights, eager for blood and glory, would break formation and give chase. Their heavy horses would thunder after the fleeing nomads, the riders screaming for slaughter. But the Magyars weren't fleeing. They were resetting the trap. As the knights spread out, their formation disintegrating in the pursuit, the Magyars would turn in their saddles. Without slowing down, without turning their horses, they would loose a second volley directly into the faces of their pursuers. Then, at a signal from a horn or a banner, the fleeing mass would suddenly wheel about, surrounding the exhausted, scattered knights and butchering them piece by piece. They had done this at the Battle of Brenta in 899, destroying an Italian army 3 times their size. They had done it at Pressburg in 907, wiping out the entire Bavarian nobility in a single afternoon. For 50 years, Europe had been their hunting ground. They had sacked Pavia, burned the suburbs of Verdun, and watered their horses in the rivers of southern France. They had even reached the Pyrenees, gazing into Spain. There were no borders they could not cross, no armies they could not outmaneuver. They moved faster than news could travel. A village would be tending its crops in the morning, and by noon, it would be smoke and ash, the population dragged away into slavery, the Magyars already gone, vanishing like mist. This speed bred a psychological paralysis in the West. How do you fight an enemy who is everywhere and nowhere? How do you defend a border when the enemy can ride past your forts before you even know they are there? The Magyar Confederation was not a mindless horde, but a highly organized state. They had a hierarchy of commanders, a system of logistics, and a clear strategic vision. They knew the politics of Europe better than the Europeans knew the steppes. They played kings against dukes, supported rebels against emperors, and accepted tribute from everyone. The army that sat outside Augsburg was the culmination of this system. It was led by Bölkső and Lel, men who were not just tribal chieftains but experienced generals. Bölkső had been to Constantinople, he had dined with emperors and seen the great walls of the Theodosian defenses. He knew how empires fell. He knew that the Franks, for all their iron and stone, were divided. But there was a flaw in the Magyar way of war, a subtle weakness hidden beneath their decades of victory. They were specialists in mobility, in open field dominance, in the war of maneuver. They were not siege engineers. They could starve a city, they could storm a weak wall, but they lacked the heavy machinery, the trebuchets, the battering rams, the sappers, to systematically dismantle a fortress like Augsburg. This is why they needed speed. They needed to break Augsburg quickly, before the German king could mobilize. They needed to terrify the garrison into surrender. On the plains below the city, the Magyars began their psychological warfare. They paraded their strength. They lit thousands of fires at night, making their numbers seem infinite. They rode close to the walls, taunting the defenders, displaying the loot and captives from the surrounding countryside. They wanted the men on the walls to feel the hopelessness of their position. But they also prepared for the assault. They built ladders. They crafted wicker shields to protect themselves from the defenders' stones. They were adapting, evolving. For 50 years, the West had tried to catch them. Heavy cavalry had chased shadows. Infantry had stood in shield walls, only to be picked apart by arrows they couldn't answer. The Magyars had dictated the terms of every engagement. They chose where to fight, when to fight, and how to fight. But at Augsburg, the dynamic was shifting. By stopping to besiege a stone city, the Magyars had done the one thing their tactics forbade: they had pinned themselves to a map. They had traded their greatest advantage, mobility, for a chance at a strategic prize. They were betting that the terror of their name would be enough to crack the walls. They were betting that the German king, Otto, was too weak, too distracted by his own rebellious family, to march south in time. It was a calculated risk. And for the first few days, it looked like a winning bet. The walls of Augsburg were old. The mortar was crumbling. The defenders were few. The Magyar arrows swept the ramparts clear, forcing the garrison to cower behind their battlements. The storm was gathering. But storms, for all their fury, are fragile things. They require the right conditions to sustain themselves. The Magyars were the masters of the open plain, the lords of the horizon. Here, amidst the stone and the mud of the river valley, they were fighting a different kind of war. A war of inches. A war of attrition. And unknown to Bölkső, unknown to the confident warriors sharpening their sabers by the campfires, the wind was changing. Far to the north, a decision had been made. The hammer was lifted. The barbarians, outside the walls, were about to learn that they were not the only ones who had spent 50 years learning the art of war. The Germans had been watching. They had been bleeding. And they had been remembering. The composite bow is a terrifying weapon, but it has limits. It relies on muscle and sinew. It relies on the fear of the man it is pointed at. What happens when that man stops being afraid? What happens when the heavy cavalry, the clumsy knights of the West, stop chasing shadows and decide to stand their ground? The Magyars were about to find out. The art of the storm was meeting the immovability of the stone. Before we move deeper into this moment of absolute crisis, I want to ask for your help. We tell these stories because history is not just a collection of dates, but a record of human resilience in the face of impossible odds. If you find value in these narratives, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment below. It is a small gesture, but it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who believe that the past deserves to be told with honesty and depth. To understand the man riding south to save Christendom, you must first understand that in the summer of 955, Otto of Saxony was not yet the Great. He was a man holding a fractured kingdom together with bloodied hands and sheer force of will. He was 43 years old, an age that in the 10th century placed a man in his twilight or his prime, depending on how many scars he carried. Otto carried many. He sat high in the saddle, his back rigid, his eyes scanning the column of dust and iron stretching out behind him. To a casual observer, he looked every inch the warrior king, broad-shouldered, bearded, radiating the terrifying authority of the Saxon line. But inside, Otto was a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The history books often simplify wars into us against them. The Christians against the pagans. The Germans against the Magyars. But the army marching toward Augsburg was not a unified force of patriots. It was a collection of bitter rivals, disgraced nobles, and former enemies who, until a few months ago, had been trying to kill each other. Conrad the Red. 2 years earlier, Conrad had been the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He was the Duke of Lorraine, a war hero, and, most importantly, Otto's son-in-law. He was the husband of Otto's daughter, Liutgard. He was family. And in 953, he had plunged a dagger into Otto's back. Conrad had joined a rebellion led by Otto's own son, Ludolf. Together, the son and the son-in-law had torn the realm apart. They had burned cathedrals, sacked royal palaces, and waged a vicious civil war against the king. For 2 years, the German lands had consumed themselves. Brother fought brother. Fields went untilled. The smoke of burning villages choked the sky, not from foreign invaders, but from the fires of a family feud. It was this chaos, this internal rot, that had invited the Magyars. The nomads had smelled the blood in the water. They knew the Germans were too busy cutting each other's throats to guard the borders. The invasion of 955 was not an accident, it was a direct consequence of the treason committed by the men now riding in Otto's shadow. The rebellion had failed, eventually. Otto had crushed it, but the cost had been catastrophic. He had stripped Conrad of his title. He was no longer the Duke of Lorraine. He was a man in disgrace, stripped of his lands, his power, and his honor. But Otto had not executed him. This was the brutal pragmatism of medieval kingship. You could not kill every traitor, especially when the traitor was a brilliant general and you were about to face an existential threat. Otto needed swords. He needed commanders who knew how to lead heavy cavalry into the jaws of death. And so, an uneasy truce had been struck. Conrad was here, leading the Franconian contingent, not because he loved Otto, but because he had no other choice. He was a man with a ruined name. In the 10th century, a man's reputation was his only true currency. Conrad had bankrupted his. He was known as a turncoat, a kinslayer, a man who had broken his oaths. There was only one way to scrub that stain from his soul. He had to die. But he had to die well. As the army camped at night, the tension was suffocating. The Saxons, Otto's own people, kept to their fires, sharpening their blades and eyeing the Franconians with undisguised hatred. These men had faced each other across shield walls only seasons ago. Now they were expected to share bread and cover each other's flanks. Otto moved through the camp, his face a mask of iron control. He knew that one spark, one drunken argument, one old grudge flaring up, could shatter his army before they even saw a Magyar. He was not leading a nation, he was herding wolves. He stopped by the riverbank, watching the dark water of the Danube rush past. He thought of his son, Ludolf. The boy, no, the man, was not here. He had been banished, sent away to govern in Italy, far from the center of power. But his ghost haunted the camp. Otto had been forced to fight his own flesh and blood to keep his crown. He had won the war, but he had lost his family. The isolation of the king was absolute. Who could he trust? The Swabian duke, Burchard, was young and unproven. The Bavarians were fighting for their own homes, which made them desperate, but their loyalty to a Saxon king was tenuous at best. And Conrad. Conrad was a coiled spring, a man vibrating with the manic energy of someone who has already accepted his own death. Otto looked at the map in his mind. Augsburg was besieged. Bishop Ulrich was holding on by a thread. If the city fell, the Magyars would flood into the heartlands. They would take the harvest. They would take the winter stores. Famine would finish what the civil war had started. This was the precipice. Otto I was not fighting for glory. He was fighting to prevent the total extinction of his dynasty. He wanted to be emperor, the heir to Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a dream that bordered on madness. How could he claim to be the protector of Christendom when he couldn't even control his own son-in-law? How could he demand the Pope crown him in Rome when pagans were burning cities in Bavaria? The imposter syndrome must have been crushing. Every king fears he is a fraud, but for Otto, the evidence was staring him in the face. His realm was a ruin. His family was a nest of vipers. His army was a powder keg. And yet, he marched. He marched because there was no alternative. This is the quality that separates the great from the forgotten. It is not brilliance. It is not talent. It is the ability to endure the intolerable weight of responsibility when every rational instinct screams at you to run. On the morning of August 8, scouts rode into the column. Their horses were frothed with sweat, their eyes wide with the specific trauma of men who have seen too much. They have surrounded the city, the lead scout reported, gasping for air. The bishop still holds, but the walls are failing. Sire, there are so many. Otto sat on his horse, listening. The lords of the realm gathered around him, Conrad the Red, fierce and silent, Duke Burchard of Swabia, the counts and margraves. They waited for the king's reaction. If he showed fear now, the coalition would dissolve. The Franconians would turn back. The Bavarians would flee to the mountains. Otto looked at Conrad. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. The king and the traitor. The father and the son. In that look, there was a silent communication that no chronicle recorded, but which must have happened. It was an acknowledgement of the stakes. We can hate each other later, the look said. Today, we kill Magyars. Otto drew his sword. It was not a ceremonial blade. It was a weapon of war, notched and heavy. We do not count them, Otto said, his voice carrying over the nervous stamping of horses. We destroy them. He turned his horse south, toward the smoke rising in the distance. The order was given. The march accelerated. The heavy cavalry, thousands of men in chainmail hauberks, began to trot. The noise was deafening, the clatter of steel, the creak of leather, the thunder of hooves. But as they rode, Otto remained a man apart. He rode with the holy lance lashed to a standard near him, the spear believed to have pierced the side of Christ. It was a powerful talisman, a signal to his men that God was on their side. But Otto knew that relics did not win battles. Men did. And he was leading a broken army against the finest killers in the world. As the sun began to dip on the eve of battle, the army reached the forests north of Augsburg. They were close now. The smell of burning timber was in the air. The sky to the south was hazy with the dust of the Magyar maneuvers. Otto ordered the camp to be struck in silence. No trumpets. No shouting. They were entering the kill zone. He convened his war council one last time. The plan was simple, because complex plans die the moment the first arrow flies. They would advance through the rough terrain to negate the Magyar mobility. They would keep their formation tight. They would rely on the shock of the heavy cavalry charge. "They are fast," Conrad said, his voice rasping. He was checking the girth of his saddle, his movements jerky and aggressive. "They will try to pull us apart. They will feign retreat." "We know their tricks," Otto replied calmly. "We have bled enough to learn them." "I will take the flank," Conrad stated. It wasn't a request. "Put the Franconians where the fighting is thickest." Otto nodded. He gave his traitor son-in-law the most dangerous assignment on the field. It was a death sentence, and they both knew it. It was also a gift. Otto was giving Conrad the chance to wash his honor clean. "Go," Otto said. "And may God grant us victory." As the council broke up and the men returned to their lines, Otto was left alone in the deepening twilight. He removed his helmet. The cool air touched his sweat-soaked hair. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He was the king of ruin. He ruled over ashes and betrayal. But tomorrow, on the stones of the Lechfeld, he would either be the savior of Europe or a corpse in the mud. There was no middle ground. The ambition that had burned in him for 20 years, the dream of the imperial crown, hung in the balance. He remounted his horse. He did not sleep that night. Few men did. The proximity of death has a way of clarifying the mind. The petty grievances of the Civil War, the insults, the stolen lands, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the primal reality of survival. In the darkness, the sound of the Magyar drums began to drift through the trees. A rhythmic, alien pulse that mimicked the heartbeat of a beast. Otto closed his eyes and listened. He did not pray for forgiveness for the men he had killed, or the family he had fought. He prayed for strength to swing his sword one more time. The king of ruin was ready to become the king of iron. The stone was burning. That was the first thing the defenders noticed as the sun climbed toward its zenith on the second day of the siege. The limestone blocks of Augsburg's ancient walls, baked by the August heat, radiated a dry, suffocating warmth that blistered the skin. But the heat coming from the walls was nothing compared to the fire raining down from the sky. Inside the city, the air had turned solid. It was a thick, cloying mixture of dust, wood smoke, and the copper tang of old blood. The narrow streets, usually filled with the sounds of commerce, the rolling of barrels, the shouting of merchants, were now transformed into arteries of panic and preparation. Bishop Ulrich rode through this choking atmosphere on a grey mare. He wore no armor. To put on mail would have been an admission that faith was not enough, and for the morale of his people, he had to be a monument of unshakable belief. Instead, he wore his stole over a simple riding tunic. But make no mistake, the man riding the cobblestones was no longer a priest. The transformation had been absolute. In the peace of the cloister, Ulrich was a man of soft words and intricate theology. Here, in the pressure cooker of the siege, those layers had been stripped away. What remained was a core of cold, hard iron. He did not offer prayers for deliverance, he shouted orders for leverage. "Move the water barrels to the eastern gate," he commanded, pointing a withered hand at a group of terrified drapers who were cowering in a doorway. "The fire arrows will come there first. If the gate burns, we all burn. Move." The men looked at him, paralyzed. Ulrich didn't coddle them. He rode his horse into their midst, the beast snorting and stamping. "Do you want to die on your knees or on your feet? Move." They moved. This was the reality of the defense. Augsburg was not garrisoned by a legion of elite troops. It was defended by a handful of professional guards and a militia of desperate tradesmen. Butchers holding rusty axes. Masons gripping hammers. They were fighting men who had been born in the saddle, warriors who had terrorized the professional armies of Europe for decades. The disparity was laughable. But the walls, however old, were the equalizer. Outside, the Magyars were growing impatient. They were not siege engineers. They did not build great towers or intricate catapults. Their method of siege warfare was consistent with their nature: speed, volume, and terror. They swarmed. From the ramparts, the defenders watched as the Magyar lines surged forward. It wasn't a disciplined march, it was a fluid, organic movement, like a rising tide. Thousands of archers galloped to within 50 paces of the walls, released a volley, and wheeled away. The sky went dark. This is not a metaphor. The sheer density of arrows blocked the sun for a split second before the sound hit, a noise like tearing canvas as thousands of shafts slammed into wood, stone, and flesh. On the battlements, men screamed. A tanner, standing next to a crenellation, looked down to find an arrow vibrating in his shoulder. He didn't fall immediately. He stared at it, confused, his mind unable to process the violence, before his knees gave way and he collapsed into the dust. "Shields up," the captain of the guard roared, crouching behind a battered heater shield. "Don't look at them. Look at your job." Ulrich dismounted and climbed the stairs to the wall. He walked through the hail of missiles with a terrifying calmness. Arrows skittered across the stone at his feet. One embedded itself in the wooden hoarding inches from his head. He didn't flinch. He walked the line, grabbing men by the shoulders, pulling them up from the ground, shoving spears back into their hands. "They are flesh and bone." Ulrich shouted over the din of the assault. "They bleed like you. They die like you. Hold the line." The Magyars were not just shooting. They were coming up. Ladders, hastily constructed from the ravaged timber of the surrounding forests, slapped against the stone. The defenders leaned over, dropping heavy rocks, pouring boiling pitch, whatever they had scrounged. At the east gate, the crisis point arrived. A group of Magyar dismounted warriors, protected by large wicker shields, had managed to reach the base of the wall. They weren't trying to climb, they were trying to dig. They hacked at the mortar with pickaxes, seeking to undermine the foundations or batter through the wood of the gate itself. The sound of axes on wood echoed through the gatehouse, thud, thud, thud. A heartbeat of doom. Ulrich arrived just as the panic was beginning to set in. The defenders at the gate were backing away, their eyes wide, convinced the wood was about to splinter. "Open the sally port," Ulrich said. The captain stared at him. "My lord?" "They are digging because they think we are rabbits in a hole," Ulrich said, his voice low and dangerous. "Show them we are wolves. Open the port. Sortie out. Drive them from the wall." "It's suicide," the captain breathed. "It is death either way," Ulrich snapped. "Open it." The small side door groaned open. A dozen men-at-arms, led by the captain, rushed out into the blinding sunlight. The Magyars at the gate were taken by surprise. They expected cowering victims, not a charge. The Germans slammed into them, swords rising and falling in grim, efficient arcs. The wicker shields shattered. The Magyars, unarmored for close infantry combat, fell back, leaving their dead in the ditch. The Germans retreated back inside, barring the door just as a fresh wave of horsemen rode up to cut them off. Inside the gatehouse, the men leaned against the cold stone, chests heaving, blood dripping from their weapons. They looked at the old bishop. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a blessing. He simply nodded. "Good," he said. "Now brace it again." Night fell, but the temperature didn't drop. The heat was trapped in the stone, radiating out like an oven. The thirst was the worst part. The wells were low, and the exertion of the battle had drained every man dry. Ulrich did not sleep. He spent the night walking the perimeter. He saw the fires of the Magyar camp stretching out into the darkness, thousands of them, a ring of stars on the earth that mocked the stars in the heaven. The sound of their camp was a low, terrifying murmur, the whinnying of horses, the sharpening of steel, the guttural songs of the steppe. He knew the truth. They had held for a day. Maybe they could hold for 2. But the supplies were gone. The arrows were running low. The morale of the militia was a fragile thing, held together only by adrenaline and fear. Once the fatigue set in, the walls would fall. He stopped at the southern tower and looked north. The darkness there was absolute. No fires. No sound. Just the empty, silent void of the German forests. Where are you? He thought, projecting the question into the blackness. Where is the king? He knew that messengers had been sent, riding hard through the enemy lines days ago. But he also knew the odds. They had likely been run down, their bodies left for the crows in some forgotten ditch. Ulrich gripped the stone until his knuckles turned white. He felt the immense, crushing weight of history on his shoulders. If he failed here, the library of the cathedral would burn. The knowledge of centuries would be ash. The lineage of his people would be broken. He was a man of God, but in that moment, he felt a profound, aching loneliness. God was in his heaven, but the Magyars were at the gate. "My lord bishop," a young sentry whispered, approaching him cautiously. The boy couldn't have been more than 16. His face was streaked with soot and dried tears. "Are they going to kill us all?" Ulrich turned to him. He could have lied. He could have offered a platitude about the heavenly host or the protection of the saints. But he looked at the boy's trembling hands and chose the truth. "They intend to," Ulrich said softly. "But intention is not action. We are still breathing. The walls are still standing." "But for how long?" the boy asked. Ulrich looked back to the north, to the silence. "Long enough," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Go check your spear point, son. Morning comes early." As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky on August 9th, the sound changed. The Magyars were already moving. The drumming of the hooves began again. But this time, there was a different note in the air. A shift in the rhythm. On the far horizon, to the north, a scout from the Magyar lines came galloping back toward the main camp, waving his bow frantically. The sea of nomads rippled with confusion. Heads turned. The assault that had been forming at the base of the walls suddenly hesitated. Ulrich squinted against the rising sun. He saw the shift in the enemy's focus. They were turning away from the city. They were looking north. And then he saw it. It wasn't much, just a glint of light on the edge of the forest, miles away. A flash of metal catching the morning sun. Then another. And another. A line of silver forming against the dark green of the trees. The king had come. The breath rushed out of Ulrich's lungs in a sob he couldn't suppress. He slumped against the battlements, the exhaustion finally crashing over him. The siege was lifting. The Magyars were abandoning their ladders, mounting their ponies, and streaming away from the walls to meet the new threat. The pressure cooker had not exploded. It had been opened. But as Ulrich watched the enemy army about to face the northern threat, his relief turned to a cold, sickening dread. He saw the size of the Magyar host as they deployed for battle. He saw the ocean of cavalry flooding the plain. And he looked at the thin line of silver emerging from the woods. Otto had arrived, but he had arrived with a force that looked pitifully small against the horde on the Lechfeld. "God help him," Ulrich whispered, the wind snatching the words from his lips. "He hasn't come to save us. He's come to die with us." While Bishop Ulrich prayed for time on the walls of Augsburg, an army was moving through the Rau Alb, the rugged hill country to the north. But this was not an army in the way the Romans would have understood it, nor was it the disciplined machine of later centuries. It was a column of iron, mud, and bad blood. King Otto I was marching south, and he was marching fast. The logistics of moving a medieval army are often glossed over in favor of the battles themselves, but the march is where the war is truly fought. Otto was moving 8,000 men, mostly heavy cavalry, through dense forests and narrow river valleys. These were men encased in mail hauberks weighing 30 pounds. Their horses, the destructive engines of the Frankish way of war, required massive amounts of fodder and water. The heat was just as oppressive under the canopy of the trees as it was on the walls of Augsburg. The air in the forest was stagnant, thick with the smell of pine resin, horse sweat, and unwashed bodies. There was no conversation. The order for silence had been given days ago. The only sounds were the creak of leather saddles, the clink of bit rings, and the muffled thud of hooves on the soft earth of the forest floor. Otto rode near the front, surrounded by his personal guard. But his eyes were fixed on the standard-bearer riding beside him. Lashed to a tall pole, catching the occasional shaft of sunlight piercing the leaves, was the Holy Lance. To the modern mind, it is just an object, a winged spearhead, wrapped in silver wire, containing an iron nail. But to the men of the 10th century, this was not metal. It was a conduit. This was the spear of destiny, the weapon that had pierced the side of Christ on Golgotha. It had belonged to Constantine, to Charlemagne. It was the physical manifestation of God's favor. Otto did not carry it because he believed it would shoot lightning bolts at the Magyars. He carried it because he knew the minds of his men. He knew that they were terrified. They were marching to fight a ghost, an enemy that had never been decisively beaten in open battle. They needed to believe that they were not just fighting for a king, but for the Creator himself. The lance was a psychological anchor. It told the shivering farm boy and the cynical veteran alike, "You will not die in vain. Heaven is watching." But as Otto looked back at the column stretching for miles behind him, he knew that relics alone would not save them. He needed order. The chronicler Widukind of Corvey, who likely spoke to veterans of this march, describes the army as being divided into 8 legions. This was a deliberate structure, a way to impose Roman discipline on a feudal coalition. The first 3 legions were Bavarians. These men were the tip of the spear, and for good reason. They were fighting on their own soil. The smoke they could smell on the wind was coming from their own burning villages. They were led by the lieutenants of Duke Henry, Otto's brother, who lay sick and dying far away. The Bavarians were motivated by a specific, razor-sharp rage. They knew the terrain, they knew the enemy, and they had the most to lose. The 4th Legion was the most volatile, the Franconians, led by Conrad the Red. Otto had placed them in the center, a position of honor but also of control. Conrad rode at their head, his face grim. His men were silent, sensing the tension. They were the Traitors' Legion, the men who had rebelled. Now, they marched with a discipline that bordered on the fanatical. They were not just marching to war, they were marching to an inquest where the verdict would be delivered in blood. The 5th Legion was the Royal Legion. These were the Saxons, Otto's own people. The elite. They surrounded the king and the Holy Lance. They were the heaviest cavalry, the men with the best armor and the biggest horses. They were the hammer that Otto intended to swing when the moment was right. Behind them came the 6th and 7th Legions, the Swabians, commanded by Duke Burchard III. Burchard was young, eager, and perhaps a bit naive. His men were sturdy, but they lacked the hardened edge of the Saxons or the desperate fury of the Bavarians. They were the reserves, the weight to be thrown in when the lines began to buckle. And finally, trailing in the rear, was the 8th Legion, the Bohemians. 1,000 elite soldiers sent by Boleslaw's I. They were tasked with guarding the baggage train, the carts of supplies, the spare horses, the servants. It was the least glamorous job in the army, but arguably the most vital. If the baggage was lost, the army would starve. This was the coalition. A patchwork quilt of tribes and tongues, stitched together by the will of one man. As they neared the river Lech, the terrain became treacherous. The ground was uneven, broken by scrub and ravines. Otto kept them in the cover of the woods for as long as possible. He knew that if the Magyars caught them in the open while they were still in column formation, it would be a slaughter. The Magyars needed open plains to execute their encirclement tactics. Otto needed to deny them that space. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse was wearing 50 pounds of iron. The tension in the ranks was palpable. Every snapping twig sounded like a bowstring. Every shadow looked like a horseman. The men were exhausted. They had been marching for days at a punishing pace. Their water was low. Their armor was chafing their skin raw. Why did they do it? Why did they follow this man into the teeth of a monster? Otto was not yet an emperor. He was a king whose reign had been defined by civil war. He had fought his own family more than he had fought the pagans. To many in the ranks, his claim to the throne was still cemented in wet mud, not stone. I want you to pause for a moment and place yourself in that column. The heat is suffocating. You are thirsty. You are marching toward an enemy that your father and grandfather failed to defeat. You are following a king who recently had to conquer his own dukes to get them to stand here. If your king asked you to die for a crown he hadn't yet earned, would you stand your ground? It is a question that defines the feudal age. Loyalty was not an abstract concept, it was a transaction of faith. And on that march, Otto was asking for a line of credit that no ruler had successfully drawn in 50 years. By the afternoon of August 9, the vanguard of the Bavarian legions reached the tree line. The scouts pulled up, signaling for the column to halt. Otto rode forward, the holy lance bobbing above him. He pushed his horse through the final screen of brush and looked out. Below them lay the Lechfeld. It was a vast, gravelly floodplain, cut through by the winding, swollen waters of the Lech River. And it was moving. From the vantage point of the woods, the German army could see the entirety of the Magyar host. It was a sight that would have broken lesser men. The plain was teeming with riders. The smoke from their campfires created a haze that hung over the valley. The noise was like the buzzing of a disturbed hive, thousands of voices, thousands of horses. They saw the city of Augsburg in the distance, a small island of stone in a sea of enemies. They saw the siege ladders abandoned near the walls. They saw the Magyar army wheeling, turning its gaze away from the city and toward the forests. The element of surprise was gone. The Magyars knew they were there. Otto watched as the enemy formation began to shift. It was liquid, terrifyingly fast. Squadrons of horse archers broke off from the main body, fanning out to probe the river crossings. They were preparing to cross the Lech, to circle around, to find a way to strike. Otto lowered his visor. The time for marching was over. The time for politics, for feuds, for doubts, it was all gone. He turned to the standard-bearer. "Raise it," he commanded. The holy lance was lifted high, the silver wire catching the sun. A ripple went through the German lines. Swords were drawn, the sound of steel on scabbards ringing out like a singular, metallic breath. They were 8,000 men against the horizon. They were tired, thirsty, and afraid. But as they looked at the lance, and then at the grim silhouette of their king, they realized the only way home was through the enemy. The mist of the forest was behind them. The fire was ahead. Otto kicked his horse forward. The march into the mist was finished. The day of blood had arrived. The sun rose on August 10th, the feast of St. Lawrence, bringing with it a heat that felt less like weather and more like a judgment. In the Christian calendar, St. Lawrence was a martyr roasted alive on a gridiron, a man who had famously joked with his torturers, "Turn me over, I am done on this side." It was a grim patron saint for a day that promised nothing but fire and suffering. Otto's army had deployed in the traditional Frankish manner. They expected a collision. The heavy cavalry was arrayed in a line, horses shoulder to shoulder, a wall of steel designed to smash forward. The men were tense, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the main body of the Magyar host was massing. They gripped their lances, knuckles white, waiting for the signal, waiting for the ground to shake. But the ground did not shake from the front. It shook from behind. The Battle of Lechfeld did not begin with a trumpet blast or a heroic charge. It began with a massacre. While Otto was staring at the horizon, the Magyar commanders, Bulcsú and Lel, had executed a maneuver of terrifying brilliance. Under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, a massive contingent of their light cavalry, perhaps a third of their entire force, had slipped away from the main body. They had ridden hard to the west, finding an unguarded ford across the swollen Lech River. They crossed in silence, thousands of horses splashing through the muddy water, unseen and unheard. They looped wide, moving through the scrub and the broken terrain that Otto had thought protected his flank. They didn't aim for the German knights. They aimed for the German vulnerability. The 8th Legion. The Bohemians. The Bohemians were the rear guard. They were marching kilometers behind the main force, guarding the baggage train. This was the lifeline of the army, carts loaded with grain, spare weapons, water barrels, and the camp followers who tended to the wounded. The Bohemians were good soldiers, but they were not deployed for battle. They were in marching order, relaxed, thinking the war was kilometers ahead of them. The attack hit them like a physical blow. One moment, there was the creak of cart wheels and the low murmur of conversation. The next, the air was black with arrows. The sound of the ambush was distinctive, a chaotic, high-pitched screaming that cut through the morning air. The Magyar horsemen descended on the baggage train from all sides. They didn't charge in a line, they swarmed like wasps. They rode between the carts, slashing at the drivers, hamstringing the draft horses, and pouring fire into the confused ranks of the Bohemian infantry. It was not a battle. It was a butchery. The Bohemians tried to form a shield wall, but there was no time. The Magyars were everywhere, riding circles around the wagons, shooting point-blank into the faces of men who hadn't even drawn their swords. Panic, cold and absolute, swept through the rear guard. Men broke ranks. They tried to crawl under the wagons or run for the perceived safety of the woods. But you cannot outrun a steppe pony. In minutes, the 8th Legion ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Magyars overran the baggage train. They began to loot, tearing open sacks of grain, dragging women from the carts, and cutting the throats of the wounded. The noise of the disaster, the screams of dying men, the braying of panicked mules, rolled forward like a wave, reaching the rear of the Swabian and Bavarian legions. Otto, riding near the front with the Holy Lance, heard the change in the air. He saw the heads of his commanders turn. He saw the ripple of confusion travel up the line. A messenger from the rear came galloping through the ranks, his horse bleeding, his face a mask of terror. "They are behind us," the man screamed, pointing back the way they had come. "The Bohemians are broken. The baggage is lost." The news hit the German command like a hammer. This is the moment where armies dissolve. The fear of encirclement is primal. Every soldier knows that if the enemy is behind you, there is no retreat. There is no home. There is only the cage. The Swabian legions, closest to the disaster, began to waver. Men looked over their shoulders. Shields lowered. The psychological integrity of the shield wall began to fracture. If the panic spread, the German army would rout before they had even engaged the main enemy force. They would be cut down from behind while fleeing. Otto had seconds to act. He could not turn the entire army. The main Magyar host was still in front of him, waiting for that exact moment of weakness to strike. If he turned his back on Bulcsú to fight the ambushers, he would be crushed between two stones. He needed a miracle. Or, more precisely, he needed a madman. He needed someone who could take a single legion, ride back into the chaos, and do the impossible, stop the rout, retake the baggage, and drive off a force that outnumbered them. Otto looked at Conrad the Red. The disgraced Duke was already looking at him. Conrad's helmet was on, his visor raised. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a strange, frantic intensity. He had heard the screams. He knew what was happening. And he knew what it meant. This was not just a tactical crisis. It was a door opening. For 2 years, Conrad had lived in the shadow of his own treason. He had walked through the halls of power as a pariah, the man who had stabbed his king in the back. He had listened to the whispers. He had seen the way other nobles spat on the ground when he passed. He was a dead man walking, sustained only by the pride of his lineage and the weight of his sword. He didn't wait for Otto to give the order. He didn't wait for a plan. Franconians! Conrad roared, his voice cracking with the strain. He wheeled his horse around, turning his back on the main battle line, turning his face toward the smoke and the slaughter in the rear. With me. It was a suicide mission. The Franconians were heavy cavalry. They were built for the charge, not for a chaotic melee among burning wagons. To ride back into that mess was to ride into a trap. But the Franconians followed him. They followed him because he was their duke, and because they, too, carried the stain of the rebellion. They needed this redemption as much as he did. Conrad kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks. The animal surged forward. The 4th Legion peeled off from the main line, a river of steel reversing its course. They rode past the wavering Swabians, shouting insults and encouragement. Stand fast. Hold the line. Conrad screamed as he galloped past the terrified infantry. We will clear the rats. They hit the rear with the force of a landslide. The Magyars, drunk on victory and plunder, were not expecting a counterattack. They had dismounted to loot the wagons. They were dragging sacks of loot, fighting over captives, celebrating the destruction of the German rear. They had forgotten the one rule of fighting heavy cavalry: never stop moving. Conrad caught them flat-footed. The collision was hideous. The Franconian knights didn't use their lances, the quarters were too close. They drew their broadswords and maces. They rode directly into the mass of dismounted nomads. Conrad was at the tip of the wedge. He fought with a reckless, terrifying abandon. He wasn't fighting to survive, he was fighting to erase the past. Every blow he struck was a penance. He smashed through a group of Magyars who were trying to cut the traces of a supply wagon. He trampled a man who tried to hamstring his horse. The fighting among the wagons was brutal and intimate. It was a brawl. Horses panicked in the confined spaces, kicking and biting. Men grappled in the mud, daggers seeking gaps in armor. The air was thick with dust and the smell of opened bowels. The Magyars tried to remount, to regain their mobility, but the Franconians were on top of them. The heavy warhorses of the Germans, usually a liability in a skirmish, became battering rams. They crushed the lighter steppe ponies. The weight of the Frankish mail, usually a burden in the heat, became their salvation, turning aside the desperate slashes of Magyar sabers. Conrad was everywhere. He rallied the survivors of the Bohemian Legion, pulling men up from the ground, shoving them back into line. Form up, he bellowed, his sword dripping. They are not devils. They are thieves. Kill them. The momentum shifted. The Magyars, realizing they had lost the initiative, began to break. They had come for easy loot, not a grinded-out fight with enraged knights. They scrambled onto their ponies, dropping their plunder, and fled back toward the river. Conrad didn't chase them far. He knew the discipline of the chase was the trap. He reined in his horse, his chest heaving, his armor dented and streaked with blood. He looked around the wreckage of the baggage train. Bodies were everywhere, Bohemian and Magyar tangled together in death. But the wagons were secure. The rear was safe. The panic that had threatened to dissolve the army had been strangled in its crib. Conrad wiped the sweat from his eyes. He looked at his men. The Franconians were battered, panting, but they were alive. And they stood taller. They had done the dirty work. They had saved the army. But there was no time for celebration. The sound of the main battle was beginning to rise from the south. The real fight, the collision between Otto and the main Magyar host, was about to begin. Conrad turned his horse back toward the front. "We are not finished," he shouted. To the king. The 4th Legion rode back to their position in the line. As they passed the Swabians and Bavarians again, there was no spitting. There were nods of respect. The traitors had paid their dues. When Conrad rejoined the main line, Otto glanced at him. There were no words exchanged. There didn't need to be. The nod from the king was enough. "You have returned." But the situation facing them now was dire. The sun was high overhead. The heat was scorching. The Magyars, having failed to roll up the flank, were now preparing for a frontal assault. And this time, there would be no tricks. The main Magyar host, tens of thousands strong, began to move. They didn't charge in a block. They moved in waves, a rolling tide of horse archers designed to break the German formation through sheer attrition. They came within range, about 200 meters, and the sky darkened again. The arrow storm that hit the German line was denser than anything they had faced at the siege. It was a torrential downpour of steel. Men fell in the ranks. Horses reared, screaming as shafts pierced their necks. The German knights lowered their heads, hiding behind their kite shields, praying the mail would hold. "Hold!" Otto's voice boomed out, amplified by his commanders. "Do not break. Do not chase." This was the test of discipline Otto had spent years drilling into them. The instinct of a knight under fire is to charge, to close the distance and stop the archers. But to charge prematurely against Magyars was death. They would simply retreat, firing backward, leading the heavy cavalry into an ambush. They had to take it. They had to stand there, in the baking heat, and let the Magyars shoot at them. They had to wait for the mistake. And the mistake came from the weather. It started as a darker gray on the horizon, distinct from the smoke of the campfires. The air pressure dropped. The humidity spiked. A summer storm was building over the Lechfeld. For a Magyar archer, rain is the enemy. The composite bow is held together with animal glue. When it gets wet, the glue softens. The tension leaves the limbs. The range drops. The power evaporates. The first heavy drops of rain sizzled on the hot armor of the German knights. Otto felt the water on his face. He looked up. It wasn't just a shower, it was a deluge. The heavens opened up, turning the dust of the plain into mud in a matter of minutes. The Magyar rate of fire slowed. Their bowstrings became slick. Their arrows began to fall short, skidding harmlessly in the wet grass. This was the moment. The Magyars hesitated. Their tactical advantage, the range and power of their bows, was being washed away by the rain. They were light cavalry, unarmored, sitting on small ponies, staring at a line of heavy iron men who were no longer under fire. Otto raised the holy lance. The water streamed down the silver wire, washing away the dust of the march. "Now," he screamed. "In the name of God. Forward!" The German line surged. It wasn't a gallop at first. It was a trot. A wall of mail and horseflesh moving in unison. The ground shook. Conrad the Red, back in the line, let out a howl that was half prayer, half curse. He spurred his horse. The Franconians, smelling blood, accelerated. The Magyars tried to turn. They tried to execute the feigned retreat. But the mud betrayed them. Their ponies slipped. The footing was treacherous. And the Germans were coming too fast. The trot became a canter. The canter became a gallop. The impact was seismic. The German wedge smashed into the Magyar line with the force of a freight train hitting a wooden fence. Lances shattered. Horses collided chest to chest. The lighter Magyar ponies were bowled over by the sheer mass of the Western warhorses. It was no longer a battle of maneuver. It was a crush. The Germans drove deep into the Magyar formation, hacking left and right with broadswords. The reach of the German weapons, the height of their horses, the thickness of their armor, in the mud and the rain, these were the only things that mattered. Conrad was in the thick of it again. He had broken his lance on the first impact. He was fighting with his sword, a demon in wet iron. He cut down a standard-bearer. He smashed the face of a chieftain. He was laughing, a terrible, breathless sound. He was alive. He was redeemed. He was winning. The Magyars panicked. Their system relied on space, on speed, on the ability to disengage. But they were trapped by the river behind them, trapped by the mud, trapped by the iron wall pushing them relentlessly backward. For the first time in 50 years, the invincible nomad army was not fading away like mist. It was being pinned down and slaughtered. But the battle was not over. The Magyars were numerous, and they were desperate. As the initial shock of the charge wore off, the melee disintegrated into 1,000 individual duels. And in the heat of the killing, Conrad the Red made a mistake. Their system relied on space, on speed, on the ability to disengage. But they were trapped by the river behind them, trapped by the mud, trapped by the iron wall pushing them relentlessly backward. For the first time in 50 years, the invincible nomad army was not fading away like mist. It was being pinned down and slaughtered. But the battle was not over. The Magyars were numerous, and they were desperate. As the initial shock of the charge wore off, the melee disintegrated into 1,000 individual duels. Conrad, a man possessed, pushed deeper than anyone else. He was at the heart of the killing, fighting not for his king, but for his ruined name. He cut down a standard-bearer, he smashed the face of a chieftain. He was winning the battle, and he was winning his redemption. He pushed his Franconians through the final knots of resistance, driving the remaining Magyars toward the river. When the fighting finally subsided around him, he was left standing in a small clearing of dead men, his armor dented and streaked with blood, panting in the suddenly silent, humid air. He had saved the baggage. He had led the charge. The king's traitor had become his savior. The king of ruin, watching from the center, glanced at him. There were no words exchanged. There didn't need to be. The nod from the king was enough. There would be time to mourn later. Now, there was only the pursuit. The sky over the Lechfeld did not just darken, it bruised. For hours, the heat had been a physical weight, pressing down on the armored men until they gasped for air like fish on a riverbank. But in the late afternoon, the pressure broke. The humidity, which had been building since dawn, suddenly coalesced into towering anvil clouds that blotted out the sun. The temperature plunged. The wind picked up, whipping the banners of the legions into a frenzy. And then, the heavens opened. It was a torrential summer downpour, the kind that turns dry creek beds into raging torrents in minutes. For a farmer, this rain would have been a blessing. For the Magyar army, it was a catastrophe. To understand why, we must look at the physics of their supremacy. The Magyar composite bow was a marvel of engineering, a lamination of wood, horn, and sinew held together by animal glue. It was a weapon born of the dry, arid steppes. It breathed in the dry air and exhaled death. But in the humidity and direct soaking of a Bavarian storm, the weapon began to die. The moisture seeped into the unsealed sinew. The glue, derived from fish bladders or hide, began to soften. The immense tension required to drive an arrow through mail armor evaporated. The bowstrings, made of twisted gut or silk, became slack. Across the Magyar lines, panic set in. Archers drew their strings to their ears, expecting the familiar resistance, only to feel the weapon give way like wet rope. Arrows that should have pierced shields at 200 paces were now falling harmlessly into the mud 50 yards away. The Magyar tactical system was built on range. They were designed to kill from a distance, to soften the enemy before the enemy could touch them. Now, the rain had stripped them of their claws. They were light cavalry, wearing leather or lamellar armor, sitting on small ponies, staring across the field at men encased in 30 pounds of riveted iron. And the Germans were not relying on glue. They were relying on lances of solid ash and swords of tempered steel. The rain made the iron slippery, yes, but it did not make it soft. King Otto, water streaming from his helmet, saw the shift. He felt the mud churning beneath his horse's hooves. The Lechfeld, a gravel plain only an hour ago, was turning into a swamp. The nimble Magyar ponies, reliant on speed and quick turns, began to flounder. They lost their footing in the slurry. The German warhorses, massive beasts bred to carry the weight of an armored man, did not need to be nimble. They only needed to go forward. Otto raised the holy lance. The silver wire was dull in the gloom, but the point was sharp. Iron, the cry went up from the Saxon ranks. Iron. The German line surged forward. This was the Iron Tide. It was not a poetic flourish, it was a description of mass in motion. Thousands of tons of man and horse accelerating into a wedge formation. The sound of the charge was muffled by the soft ground, creating a terrifying, low-frequency rumble that could be felt in the teeth before it was heard. The Magyars tried to turn. They tried to deploy their famous, feigned retreat, the maneuver that had killed so many Frankish armies before. But the mud betrayed them. Their ponies slipped and stumbled as they tried to wheel about. The disciplined spacing of their formation collapsed into chaos. They were not retreating, they were stuck. The collision, when it came, was absolute. The German wedge hit the stalled Magyar line with the physics of a sledgehammer striking a pane of glass. There was no finesse. The German knights didn't fence, they trampled. The heavy warhorses plowed into the lighter steppe ponies, knocking them off their feet. Lances punched through leather armor and chest cavities. The front rank of the Magyar army simply evaporated. The fighting that followed was less a battle and more a grinding suffocation. The Germans pushed. They used their shields as battering rams, their horses as weapons. They drove the Magyars backward, step by muddy step, compressing them against the banks of the rising Lech River. The Magyars fought back. They were warriors, after all, but they were fighting the wrong war. Their sabers slashed at mail that turned the blades. Their arrows bounced off kite shields. They were trapped in a phone booth with a bear. And riding at the forefront of the Franconian wedge, screaming through the rain, was Conrad the Red. He was a man possessed. His armor was a ruin of dents and scratches. His shield was splintered. He had broken his lance in the first impact and was now swinging a sword that was notched like a saw. He fought with a clarity that only comes to men who have accepted their own death. He pushed deeper than anyone else. He led his men into the thickest knots of Magyar resistance, breaking them apart with sheer violence. He was rewriting his legacy with every swing of his arm. Traitor. Rebel. Hero. Savior. The Magyars broke. It wasn't a gradual retreat. It was a collapse. Seeing their arrows fail, their horses stumble, and the iron wall closing in, the psychological dam burst. The Magyar army turned and fled. They rode for the river, desperate to cross back to the safety of the east. But the Lech was swollen with the rain. The fords were treacherous. The panic at the riverbank was horrific. Men and horses were swept away by the current. Others were trampled by their own comrades trying to escape the German pursuit. The battle was effectively won. The cohesion of the enemy was gone. The threat to Christendom, which had loomed for 50 years, was drowning in the mud of a Bavarian river. The rain stopped as quickly as it had begun. The clouds parted, and the late afternoon sun, fierce and yellow, broke through. The humidity instantly spiked, turning the battlefield into a steam bath. Conrad reined in his horse on a small rise overlooking the river. The fighting had moved away from him, downstream where the pursuit was turning into a slaughter. He was alone, surrounded by the dead. He sat there for a moment, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. His chest heaved. The heat inside his mail was unbearable. He felt the sweat pouring down his back, stinging the raw skin where the armor had rubbed him bloody. He had done it. He had survived the baggage train. He had survived the charge. He sat there for a moment, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. His chest heaved. The heat inside his helmet was unbearable. He needed to breathe. Just for a moment. Conrad reached up with a trembling hand, fumbling with the buckles of his helmet. He pulled the heavy steel helm off his head and let it drop to his saddlebow with a clatter. He took a deep, greedy gulp of the air. The mud, the steam, the sweat, it all tasted like victory. He allowed himself a grim, silent smile. He never saw the arrow. It did not come from a formation. It did not come from a duel. It was likely a parting shot from a fleeing horseman, or perhaps a wounded man lying in the grass 50 yards away, pulling his bowstring one last time with the last of his strength. It was a small thing. A piece of wood and feather. It struck Conrad in the throat, just above the collar of his mail. There was no cinematic speech. There was no final roar of defiance. The smile froze on his face. His hands flew to his neck, grasping at the shaft, but it was deep. The blood pumped out between his fingers, bright and arterial, washing over the armor he had fought so hard to polish with glory. Conrad the Red, the man who had charged into a massacre and walked out alive, the man who had broken the Magyar line, swayed in his saddle. The world turned gray. The sound of the river faded. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the mane of his horse. He slid sideways, falling into the mud with a heavy, wet thud. The horse, spooked, trotted away a few paces and then stopped to graze on a patch of grass that wasn't stained red. Conrad lay on his back. The sun he had wanted to feel on his face was blinding now. He tried to speak, to call for his men, but his lungs were full of blood. He died alone, in the silence behind the roar of the victory he had secured. It was the ultimate, devastating irony. He had sought death in the thickest fighting, begging history to take him while he was a hero. History had waited until he thought he was safe. It waited until he had loosened his armor to catch his breath, and then it took him with a single, anonymous piece of wood. Conrad reached up with a trembling hand. There was no final roar of defiance. The smile froze on his face. His hands flew to his neck, grasping at the shaft, but it was deep. The blood pumped out between his fingers, bright and arterial, washing over the armor he had fought so hard to polish with glory. Conrad the Red, the man who had charged into a massacre and walked out alive, the man who had broken the Magyar line, swayed in his saddle. The world turned gray. The sound of the river faded. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the mane of his horse. He slid sideways, falling into the mud with a heavy, wet thud. The horse, spooked, trotted away a few paces and then stopped to graze on a patch of grass that wasn't stained red. Conrad lay on his back. The sun he had wanted to feel on his face was blinding now. He tried to speak, to call for his men, but his lungs were full of blood. He died alone, in the silence behind the roar of the victory he had secured. It was the ultimate, devastating irony. He had sought death in the thickest fighting, begging history to take him while he was a hero. History had waited until he thought he was safe. It waited until he had loosened his armor to catch his breath, and then it took him with a single, anonymous piece of wood. When the Franconian knights found him later, the battle was over. They stood around his body in silence. They did not cheer the victory. They looked at the helmet hanging from the saddle, and the arrow in the throat, and they understood the price of the day. The iron tide had swept the Magyars from the field. But it had left the best of them in the mud. The sun set on the Lechfeld, but the killing did not stop. In most medieval battles, the end of the fighting signaled a negotiation. Prisoners were taken. Ransoms were calculated. The defeated nobility would be traded back to their families for chests of silver. War was a business, and dead men paid no debts. But Lechfeld was not a business transaction. It was an exorcism. King Otto I had not ridden south to defeat an army, he had ridden south to destroy an idea. He needed to prove to the world that the Plaga Day was mortal. He needed to show that the 50 years of terror, the burning of monasteries, the enslavement of children, that all of it ended here, in the Bavarian mud. And so, the order was given, no quarter. The pursuit that followed the battle was arguably more brutal than the fighting itself. The Magyar army had shattered into fragments. Thousands of survivors, separated from their commanders and their horses, fled into the countryside. They hid in the forests, in the reed beds of the river, in the barns of abandoned villages. But the locals were waiting. For decades, the Bavarian peasantry had lived in fear. They had watched their crops burn and their daughters dragged away in chains. Now, the dynamic was reversed. The hunters had become the prey. Farmers armed with pitchforks and flails hunted down starving Magyar warriors in the woods. Garrisons from nearby towns, hearing news of the victory, sortied out to block the escape routes. The river crossings were choked with bodies. It was a systematic erasure. Contemporary chronicles describe the days following the battle as a great silence falling over the land, broken only by the executions. The sheer scale of the death is difficult to comprehend. Of the massive host that had arrived to besiege Augsburg, only a fraction ever saw the Carpathian Basin again. But the grim finale of this tragedy did not happen in the woods. It happened in the city of Regensburg. 3 men were brought before Duke Henry of Bavaria in chains. They were Bulksu, Lel, and Sir, the supreme commanders of the Magyar Confederation. These were men who had dined with emperors in Constantinople, who had commanded tens of thousands of warriors, who had held the fate of Europe in their hands. Bulksu, the man who had been baptized and then apostatized, stood defiant. Lel, the hero of Magyar legend, was silent. In a different war, they might have been treated as honored captives. But Duke Henry was dying of a sickness that rotted his flesh, and his hate for the Magyars burned hotter than his fever. He looked at the men who had ravaged his duchy for a generation. He did not ask for ransom. He did not ask for a treaty. Hang them, Henry rasped. It was a death reserved for common criminals. Not the sword, which was honorable. Not the axe. The rope. The 3 great warlords were dragged to the gallows in Regensburg. They were stripped of their silks and their armor. As the noose tightened around Bulksu's neck, the era of the Magyar raids died with him. The message was clear: you are not conquerors. You are bandits. And you will die like bandits. The news of their death, and the total destruction of their army, sent a shockwave through the Magyar homelands. For 50 years, their economy had relied on plunder. Their social structure was built on the prestige of the raid. Now, the flower of their warrior caste was dead in a German field. The survivors who stumbled back to the Pannonian Basin brought with them a terrifying truth: the West has woken up. The Iron Men are no longer afraid. This moment forced a civilization-level choice. The Magyars stood at a crossroads. They could continue the old ways, launching smaller, desperate raids until they were slowly ground into dust by the rising power of the Germans. Or, they could adapt. They chose survival. Grand Prince Gaza, and later his son, Stephen, who would become Saint Stephen, understood that to survive in Europe, they had to become Europe. They invited missionaries, the very priests they used to butcher, into their lands. They built stone churches on the foundations of their yurts. They traded their composite bows for the heavy plow. In the span of a single generation, the once feared Magyars, transformed into the Kingdom of Hungary, a bulwark of Christendom that would one day defend Europe against the Ottomans. The Battle of Lechfeld didn't just save Germany, it created Hungary. But back on the field of victory, a different transformation was taking place. The morning after the battle, the German army assembled on the plain. The bodies were being cleared. The smell of death was overpowering, but the men standing in the ranks didn't seem to notice. They were looking at one man. Otto sat on his horse, the holy lance still by his side. He was exhausted, his face lined with the stress of the campaign, but he was alive. And he had won. He had done what his father could not. He had done what the Carolingians could not. He had united the fractious tribes of the Germans, Saxons, Franconians, Swabians, Bavarians, Bohemians, and led them to a victory that would echo for 1,000 years. The soldiers began to beat their weapons against their shields. It started as a low rhythm, then grew into a roar. Imperator! 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 They were acclaiming him emperor on the field of battle, just as the Roman legions had done for their generals in antiquity. It wasn't an official coronation, that would come later, in Rome, in 962, but it was the spiritual birth of the Holy Roman Empire. At that moment, the political map of Europe calcified. The fluid, chaotic tribal borders of the Dark Ages began to harden into the shapes of nations. The East Frankish kingdom was no longer a loose collection of duchies, it was the German realm, Regnum Teutonicum. The Age of Migrations, which had begun with the fall of Rome and seen the movement of Goths, Vandals, Huns, and Vikings, effectively ended on the Lechfeld. The borders were drawn. The nomads were halted. The settled agricultural societies of the West had proven that they could defend their land. Otto looked out over his army. He saw the gaps in the ranks where the dead should have been. He saw the Franconians, leaderless without Conrad. He saw the Bavarians, their homeland saved but scorched. He understood the price. The victory at Lechfeld was not free. It was paid for with the blood of men like Conrad the Red, men who had to die to prove they were loyal. It was paid for by the peasants of Augsburg, by the monks of the borderlands, by the thousands of nameless infantry who lay in the mud. But as Otto turned his horse north, leaving the grave of the Magyar army behind him, he carried with him the certainty of a new order. Europe was safe. The long nightmare of the invasions was over. The bells of Augsburg began to ring again. Bishop Ulrich, standing on the walls that were no longer under siege, offered a mass of thanksgiving. The smoke cleared from the valley. And history turned a page. We live in the world that Otto and Ulrich and Conrad built. A world of settled borders, of nations, of a Europe defined by its resistance to external threats. The Battle of Lechfeld is not just a story of knights and arrows. It is the story of how a civilization decided it wanted to live. It reminds us that history is not inevitable. It turns on the decisions of individuals, on a bishop who refuses to run, on a traitor who decides to charge, on a king who holds his ground in the rain. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the pivotal moments of history, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to tell, stories of power, betrayal, and the forging of the modern world. Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened. It's who we are.